So why are we here tonight? There are really two objectives. Obviously, the first is to discuss and examine the findings on the 2019 Armed Conflict Survey, which we'll go into sort of what that is throughout the series of this evening. It's a comprehensive reference on current armed conflicts around worldwide, and covers the key events and developments in 33 conflicts across 6 regions in 2018. It's a sort of go-to resource, if you will, for those involved in security policymaking and analysis. So that was the first, is to sort of discuss and explore. And the second was really to bring together established public policy and international affairs professionals with young, new, or just interested entrants into the field. So this is really, the next hour is really your hour to engage, share, and really learn from one another. I'm going to sort of introduce our 2 speakers, and then I'd like to ask a couple of you to share with us sort of what brought you here, or in terms of what piqued your interest in tonight's topic. And then I'll ask the speakers as well to tell us a little bit about themselves in terms of how did they come to this field, what brought them to not necessarily just to tonight, but sort of to where they are in their careers. So Francesca Grandi is editor of the Armed Conflict Survey and senior fellow for conflict security and development. She has extensive expertise on conflict analysis, prevention, and post-conflict resolution. Welcome.
Thank you.
Virginia Comolli leads the Conflict Security and Development Program and has extensive experience on sub-Saharan Africa, organized crime, and extremism. So thank you also for joining us tonight. So before we get started, can I just have maybe 2 or 3 of you, if you could just share with us sort of what was it that piqued your interest about tonight's topic? What was it that brought you here tonight?
Graduate student in the Masters of Public Administration program. Our class is here this evening, but I was particularly interested in learning about the civilian context within conflict and sort of how that's changed and what does that mean for people around the world who are in conflict zones.
From a civilian perspective, okay.
Hi, my name is Dorene Martinez. I'm an undergraduate in the same class. I'm at Baruch for the undergraduate public affairs course. I just found out our class is coming here, but I'm interested in issues of terrorism and conflict because they're plaguing our world so much, and we need to be better at trying to deal with it, helping civilians be as minimally effective as possible, and trying to eradicate it, hopefully. So I'm hoping to gain more perspective from professionals on that.
Excellent, thank you. So more of it from a sort of how to response given the heightened incidents around terrorism. Anyone else? Yes.
I'm just here because I'm a part of the PPI network, and I'm just here to learn more about this topic. I've never heard of it before.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you for coming. Okay, so I think that kind of gives us an idea of who we have, and I'm also going to ask each of you if you could just share sort of what compelled you to work in the field that you're in now, and how did you get started? And then we'll talk a little bit more about the survey itself. And
Sure. Should I start? Sure.
And can you hear us all as well? Yeah.
Please let me know, because I have a tendency to lower my voice. Yeah, actually it would be great if you just moved a little bit closer so we can maybe have a... Thank you. Yes, please. Come. Thank you. So I started working in international affairs as a volunteer in a refugee camp, and that was right after my high school. I was sort of my gap summer before starting university, and the war in the former Yugoslavia had just come to an end, and I had a free summer, so I sort of joined a group that was operating through volunteers in my hometown, and I went to volunteer in this refugee camp in close to Rijeka in Croatia, and I guess that's when I realized I wanted to work on these topics. I wanted to understand what made people do very terrible things to each other, but also I wanted to be able to contribute and find solutions for these terrible things. And that took a long-winded road, which went through working at the United Nations, and then going into academia, and then coming out of academia and going back to the field again, and then finally focusing mostly on research, and as I'm doing now at IISS.
How about you?
Yeah, well, welcome again, and thank you. It's a pleasure to be running this event jointly, so thank you again. So, well, I grew up wanting to be a fighter pilot, and I went to a semi-military high school, and wanted to join the Italian Air Force. And I will spare you the saga, the drama. Anyway, it didn't happen. And so all the flying hours, all my parents' money spent on my education and flying just went down the drain. And I said I had to find something to do with my life. So I said, well, I might as well go to London and learn English. It's always going to come in handy. And then I come back to Italy, where I'm originally from, and trying to sort my life out. But then I decided, well, why don't I pursue a career, or at least I started my studies, university studies abroad. So I applied for university courses in the UK, and I did my undergrad in war studies and American studies, and I was very much at the time focused on hard defense and missile defense in particular. And then I moved on to do my master's in intelligence and strategic studies, and after that I was very lucky to find a number of internships or research assistant positions with IISS, but also with some private security companies. So I was doing some research on Afghanistan and the Middle East at the time, and also some private consultancy doing some strategic foresights. And then I actually spent the past 13 years working with IISS in London. As I mentioned, I first started with the defense team that produces our annual military balance. And then I moved on to transnational threats. And then about 5 years ago, I went rogue and set up a new program on security and development, which I think it was, I dare say, a rather important shift in the intellectual agenda of the organization, which traditionally is focused on hard security and defense, but really grew out of the realization, also among our senior leadership, that we needed to look at security issues and conflict from a broader perspective, to include more of a humanitarian and developmental angle alongside security and defense considerations. And then last year we decided to merge my old program on security and development with the armed conflict team, and so now we have this conflict security and development program, which consists of a number of very talented and diverse and international researchers, and I'm very proud to have people from Europe, from the Middle East, from Africa, from Latin America, represented in the team, alongside also a number of freelance researchers who are scattered around the world. And we also cooperate quite closely with our office in Washington, D.C., and also our other offices in Bahrain and in Singapore. So what brought me to this field is that I was first interested in defense issues, but the more I study these topics, the more I was interested in the human dimension. Mm-hmm. And that was really brought me to focus more on conflict, and so issues related to perhaps what we could call soft security became more of interest for me.
It's interesting, and just so you know, that we will open this up to the broader for questions, or really just have a few questions to sort of get the dialogue going, and some questions that others have submitted to me. It's interesting that you bring up, or sort of, even just when I think about peace and security and development. My husband works for the UN, and it seems like historically these have been sort of separate approaches, and that's sort of a problem in a changing world, in a dynamic world. And so it's exciting to me to see that there is much more collaboration and a much more holistic, comprehensive approach to conflict areas. So I think first of all, just to start us off on a practical basis, could one of you just explain what are the overarching themes that came through? What is the survey? What does it reveal? What are the overarching themes? And then how do you want people to use this resource?
Absolutely, thank you for that. So the book, the main aim of the book is to become a reference for people who want to understand conflict. So the book is formed by conflict reports that focus on each ongoing conflict around the world. And each of these reports analyzes conflict from many perspectives in a systematic way, so that all these reports are actually comparable. So we are looking at the history of the conflict, we are looking at what are the drivers of the conflict, so both the underlying causes but also the more immediate triggers. And then we are looking at the actors and the conflict parties that are involved, and we are looking at their strategies, their organizational capabilities and structures, and how these influence their behavior, so that we can understand how violence unfolds and what are the elements that merge in order to produce the type of violence that we observe. And then we look at what is the impact of this violence and of the action of conflict parties onto civilians, onto the political processes of a country, and also vice versa. So what are the consequences of certain political developments onto the conflict? And then we look at how we believe the conflicts will develop over the short to medium term. And so we use these structures to look at all these 33 situations, and from all of them, then we extrapolate what we consider to be global trends. So let's say ways of analyzing and understanding conflicts that can help us not only understand conflict better today and understand better what has happened over the past year, which is what the book each year refers to, so just the year just passed, but also elements that allow us to interpret what is going to happen in the short term. So that's the book follows these structures. So we have an introduction that sort of elaborates on these global trends, and then we have 4 thematic essays that go more in depth into these dynamics, and then we have the conflict reports. The global trends that we identified for the year 2018, and we believe they're going to remain very relevant over the next few years, are the merging of global and transnational networks and dynamics with local dynamics to produce how a conflict pans out in every situation. So an example of these more global trends could be climate change, for example, or transnational networks of jihadism. And local dynamics are everything that has to do with how a society deals with conflict. So whether ethnicity plays a role in separating and excluding certain sectors of the society, whether the socioeconomic conditions of a particular part of the society actually determines whether the political process is more or less inclusive, and how this relates to then how people fight each other, and how once violence emerges, how the people who engage in violence organize themselves, and how they recruit, and how they're able to maintain these structures operating. And lastly, we look at how there are many different ways in which civilians are victimized in conflict. So a very standard metric for measuring conflict is counting the casualties. And then there are very long debates about what constitutes a conflict-related casualty. So, does the person need to be close to the battlefield? Does the person who is killed need to be killed by one of the conflict parties? And we try to have a more critical look at that, and we say that, well, actually the civilian victimizations comes in many forms, and so there are more direct casualties, but there are also very indirect casualties. So, for example, in Yemen, there was a cholera pandemics last year, and in DRC, the Ebola, and so we look at how these dynamics feed into the dynamics of the conflict, and finally how displacement is actually one of the major developments of the past few decades, and how many displaced people the most contemporary conflicts have created. I can go more in depth with on any of this, but this is sort of an overview.
Right. Actually, if it would be helpful to me if you could maybe, today's topic is statelessness, criminality, and civilian victimization. So maybe can you share, what do we mean when we say statelessness? How or where are we seeing that happen? And specifically, what challenges does that present to the individual, to the state, to intervening or service agencies?
Sure. I know Virginia has a lot to say about that.
Okay. Thank you. So yes, oftentimes we hear this phrase of ungoverned spaces, where it's the places where the state is not present. And I actually take issue with this definition of ungoverned spaces. I'd like to call them differently governed spaces, because there's never truly a vacuum. If it's not the government who's controlling a given area, it's some other non-state actors that does that. It could be a criminal actor, it could be an ideologically driven actor, but someone is going to be in there. What happens oftentimes, and I think, for instance, one of the regions that I focus more on is the Sahel and West Africa, and it is a very great case studies, because you can observe all the trends, and Francesca had mentioned, combined in this region. So the challenges are enormous. So you have areas in places such as Mali or Niger across the Sahel, where the state has very limited control. However, there are groups, oftentimes they are criminal. I think one of the key trends that we also identified is the convergence of criminal networks with conflict dynamics. So there are criminal, often organized along tribal lines that exert control over certain parts of northern Mali, for instance, where we have noticed unprecedented levels of violence for the sub-region that are very much driven by by the drug trade. And so these the presence of these criminal networks has actually altered the local political economy, has created new political and economic elites that actually replace the formal government structure. So you have some of these criminal groups that are able to provide services to the local populations in a way that government is unable to do. There are some of these criminal groups that would build schools, so they would build mosques, they would offer cash to the local population. So they actually become the key actors whose role is fundamental for the sustenance of local communities. And they come to really to be regarded
goods and
exactly.
services.
So they are respected and listened to. And this is very challenging, of course, when you have these kind of parallel systems of governance and parallel economies. Also, in the longer term, when we start talking about conflict resolutions and peace negotiations, because it means that when you're sitting around the table with all the different conflict parties, state and non-states, you have to keep those criminal agendas in mind. You have to be mindful of the fact that there are political officials, political elites that are directly involved in all these criminal activities, so they benefit from these criminal activities, and so frankly it's not in their interest to genuinely tackle those challenges, and oftentimes they use their position of power to undermine their criminal rivals. So that means that more traditional tools of peace building and peacekeeping as well don't really meet the requirements of conflict, because conflict is so multifaceted, and it's not just the traditional conflict, but is a situation where conflict, insurgency, jihadism in the case of the Sahel, in other regions, and criminality merge, and all these need to be tackled. How do you do that? The sequencing is very important, and oftentimes we've seen how counterterrorism priorities seem to take precedence over many other challenges, and sometimes the implementation of peace agreements has to take a backseat.
Mm-hmm. Reading through sort of the different chapters in the book, you mention humanitarian aid as a weapon of war, sort of these global trends, conflict expansion into cities. Can you talk a little bit about that? And then why, I have a specific question about sort of conflict entrepreneurs, because they often appeal to ethnic, religious, or geographical identities, and I didn't see that, at least initially, in sort of the overarching global trends. So I'm curious, were these the most prevalent across the globe, or are we also seeing sort of a focus on ethnic, religious, geographical, recruitment of youngsters to join armed groups? Those kind of two questions there, I guess.
Sure. Do you want to start with aid one?
Sure, of course. The very short answer to your last question is that one doesn't exclude the others.
Yeah.
So if we identify these four themes as very important to understand conflict today, doesn't mean that there are no other factors also operating at the same time. Specifically on humanitarian aid, what motivated us to discuss that in one of the essays is because in 2018, two of the most intense conflicts, Yemen and Syria, were theaters where aid became part of how some of the conflict parties tried to manipulate aid in order to gain advantage over their rivals. For example, the Assad regime used the retention of aid, and it didn't allow access to humanitarian actors to areas where the rebels challenging the regime had their stronghold. And so this is another way in which civilians are victimized during a conflict, because the very tools that were created and invented in order to ameliorate their situation during conflict are actually used to aggravate that situation. And the essay is structured in a way that it gives us sort of an overview of the many ways in which conflict parties can manipulate aid. So there are brief case studies on Yemen, on Syria, but also on South Sudan, for example, where both the state and non-state actors capture aid in order to fund their activities, which is fighting each other. And so humanitarian organizations have to pay very, very high fees in order to be able to operate in the country, but then they also have to pay passage when they encounter roadblocks when they're trying to deliver aid. And in that way, all this money that actually comes from donors in order to distribute aid gets captured by the conflict parties that are able to enrich themselves through this through the humanitarian system.
With regard to your question on recruitment along ethnic and religious lines, yeah, that's something that those are factors that we very much look into, and I think the situation in Mali at present is very pertinent to your questions. I don't know whether anyone had seen in the news yesterday that around 100 civilians were killed in central Mali. So basically what has been happening, okay, I'll cut a very long story short, is that given the rise of jihadi activities in Mali in recent years, a number of self-defense militia have emerged. And so there is also, so this on the background. There is also an issue in Mali, but in other countries, related to competition for resources such as grazing lands and water between sedentary communities, usually farmers, and nomadic herders. And usually herders are of Fulani ethnicity. And the Fulani are often stigmatized and associated with jihadism, although that's often not the case. And the competition between these two different ways of life is compounded by the effect of climate change, because normally these nomadic Fulani herders live and roam around further north. But with extensive desertification and effectively the Sahara Desert moving southwards, they are also pushed southwards looking for land, grazing land and water. And here they meet with the locals and there is a competition over resources. So we have these two different worlds, these two different challenges that actually come together, and that brings me to this incident I've just mentioned with the 100 civilians that are being killed. Those civilians belong to the Dogon ethnic group, and those were specifically targeted in retaliation for attacks that have been perpetrated by Dogon self-defense militias against the Fulani. So now the Fulanis are retaliating against Dogon communities. So this is an awful, vicious cycle that comes following another massacre that happened in March, where almost 140 Fulanis were killed by the Dogon. So these are issues that are compounded by so many other things to do with jihadism, climate change, etc. But those are actually those fights and those groups are organized along ethnic lines, and they recruit from different ethnic pools. So this is just one example, but it's something that we've seen across a number of conflicts. With regard to urban and the expansion of conflict into cities, but that's also part of a larger strand of work that we are doing at ISS with regard to the conduct of humanitarian operation and the conduct of war in cities, especially in developing and emerging regions. And we see how the conflicts sometimes come from within the city. And so we actually have one city included in the Armed Conflict Survey as a conflict, and that's Rio de Janeiro. Sometimes conflict actually comes to city from the outside. That's the case of many Syrian cities, for instance. And cities are very complex entities where you have a very high population density. You have all sorts of networks, and you have all sorts of opportunities for licit and illicit business. And we've also seen increasing, if we just look worldwide, increasing urbanization trends, especially across developing regions, with more and more people moving into cities, putting increased pressures on the local infrastructures and actually feeding the expansion of slums. And those slums are often areas where the state has limited control. So going back to what we were saying earlier about alternatively governed spaces. So you have all these different challenges, and we have, for instance, in one of the essays here in the book where we talk about conflict in cities, we use the case of Karachi in Pakistan, which is a mega city of 23 million people, and it has all sorts of security challenges you can imagine, from the criminal, the jihadi, the different political parties that have their own military arms. You have the corruption, etc., etc. You have the influence of refugees out of the conflict in Afghanistan, and all these things are layered on top of each other, and they create very high levels of violence and serious challenges for the development of a illicit economy.
I want to ask an obvious question, which is, can you sort of define for the group, when we talk about armed conflict, what are we talking about exactly? I mean, you have 33 represented in your book, but maybe could you name a few areas that maybe people would assume would be in there that are not, and why?
Absolutely. That's actually not an obvious question. It's a very good one, because in conflict studies and in understanding conflicts, the issues of methodology are always very, very challenging, and they need to be addressed, because we need to understand what we are talking about before analyzing what we are talking about. And so we take a very simple definition of conflict, but one that we believe is quite powerful, because it captures three very important elements of conflict. So conflict is a military confrontation between two or more armed actors that can be state or non-state actors, which make purposive use of violence against each other. And we have three tests to decide whether a situation is an armed conflict or not, and one is intensity, one is duration, and one is organization. So organization is the trickiest one, because it means that armed groups need to be able to conduct operations. They need to be able to, for example, communicate within themselves. They need to be able to plan and execute attacks. And then intensity and duration are easier, because we just decide on a cutoff time limit. So duration, it means that we decide that a situation is a conflict after 3 months of ongoing attacks, which have been going on intensity for at least once or twice per month. So this is sort of our very schematic definition, but it helps us to not attribute characteristics to conflicts besides these very simple features. And so for this reason, we end up with 33 situations for 2018, and we are already reviewing the list for the next year, because of course conflict is very fluid, and situations change from one characteristic to the other. So we keep monitoring the situations to decide whether the thresholds to be considered armed conflicts are met or not. The situations that you would find, the conflicts that you would find in the book that you would expect are South Sudan, Democratic Republic of Congo in Africa, for example, or in South Asia, Afghanistan or Kashmir, in Asia Pacific, the Philippines or Myanmar, in Latin America, as Virginia mentioned, Rio de Janeiro, which is the only city case that we have in the book, but also Colombia, not the FARC, of course, which is one of the conflicts that have been solved in the previous year, but the conflict between the state and bandas armadas criminales, so armed criminal gangs, thank you, and Central America, especially El Salvador and Honduras.
And I think the ones that often we are asked about that is not included is Venezuela. And the reason for that is that, as Francesca has highlighted, one of the key criteria is to do with the organization. And we assess that there might be violence from the part of the government onto civilians, but the civilians are not sufficiently organized to meet our criteria for organization. So it's one-sided violence. Hence, this situation doesn't qualify to be one of our armed conflicts. However, we are not totally ignoring it because, of course, the situation in Venezuela has a significant impact for its neighbors, especially migration flows into Colombia, and that's something that we are very much observing and studying.
If you want, just to conclude on the definition of a conflict, an armed conflict is one subset in a much larger array of situations of political violence that can go from a one-sided violence from the state toward its citizens to a full-fledged war between two states. So political violence is a much larger set, and an armed conflict, it's a subset of that bigger.
Oh, that makes sense. Thank you. When I think about armed conflict, I think about responses, state responses, and international community response. I mean, I can't really think of a time that we, the international community, have responded well. Is there a scenario where that's been the case?
That's a tough question.
Well, the British like to say that Sierra Leone was a success case, and you've been to Sierra Leone,
Yeah.
and that's often paraded as one of the positive examples. But,
That's unfortunate.
Okay.
Okay. I want to read you a statement and sort of ask your opinion in terms of what we could do differently. Einstein once said that the significant problems we face cannot be solved with the same level of thinking we were at when we created them.
Mm-hmm.
So
Brilliant.
when thinking about conflict prevention, so not necessarily our response, but prevention, which presumably would then eliminate sort of the need to respond, what do we need to do differently that maybe has not been the case in the past?
Yeah. Well, prevention is...
And it could be for both. I mean, what do we need to do differently for prevention and I guess also for response?
For sure. So prevention is one of the main issues on the agenda of the UN Secretary General. And so there's been a recognition, and I'm mentioning the United Nations because it's one of the multilateral entities that more than any other has been engaged in peacekeeping and peacemaking and peace building over the past decades. And so in a way they sort of set the norms and they accumulate the knowledge of how to respond to conflict, just because they provide the forum for many of its member states to actually respond to conflict. And prevention has historically been recognized as a fundamental tool in the toolkit of peacemakers. The problem with prevention is that it's not very sexy, and so it's very difficult to get member states and sufficiently large and solid coalitions at the international level to actually intervene before a situation has become an emergency. So very often the international community reacts. So it's a very reactive approach that we have displayed toward conflict. Despite being already quite accepted that actually prevention works, and it also is very cost effective, not only of course in terms of human lives, which is very obvious, but also in terms of foregone development and peace dividends. So the very short answer is that it's difficult to rally the political will to actually act preventively.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point because not just with the UN, but also at the national or regional levels, there are always so many crises and priorities that practitioners need to deal with. And funds always seems to be limited, resources always seems to be limited, so it's quite hard to make a case to actually devote time and resources and human capital to situations that are not crises yet, when there are so many crises ongoing. I'm more in favor of prevention, but it does really require some very strong leadership, and it requires some long-term engagement that has oftentimes nothing to do with security, but has to do with supporting the development of the local economy, improving access to schools, also include all array of developmental efforts that require long-term engagement. That's important to highlight, because what we try to do in our work within the conflict security and development program is to take a very multidisciplinary approach to what we do. So we talk to the security and the defense people, we talk to the humanitarian and development guys, we talk to the human rights. With the case of urban conflicts, we talk to city planners and architects. So we try to be, very inclusive. But you also realize that all these different actors, they might all want the same thing, so stable societies and peace, but they talk very different languages. And also they work with very different time frames. The militaries, they want results quickly. Mm-hmm. Developmental actors, they talk about generational changes. And so how do you implement those kind of long-term generational changes in parallel with the demands of political agendas and the fact that political leadership change much more quickly, and so politicians need to show their electorates that they've achieved results in a given country by the end of their mandate.
Right.
So.
I mean, when I hear you talk about prevention in that way, in terms of it takes investment, political will, sometimes it can be the same motivation, sometimes it can be different. It also makes me think about, are we interested in actually resolving conflict, or are we more interested in stabilizing and managing it?
That speaks to the prior part of your question before. So when we are in a crisis situation, and we are in a situation in which we are responding to a conflict, very often we understand what the problem is, and especially people who work on the ground, they quickly, even if they get to the field and they don't know exactly what the situation is, they quickly understand it and learn about it. The problem is that often the tools that we have to address the situation are not necessarily the tools that are needed, but we are still applying the tools we have because we have them. So very often we find that the military solution and the military approach is the one that's at hand, that is available, and so we apply it. But which clearly in a war situation you need the element, but since that we need to prioritize and the funding and the political will devoted to a situation is always limited, you need to prioritize. And so very often other elements, they're very fundamental pieces of the puzzle, are left behind in a way. So everything Virginia was talking about, so the development aspect, the reconciliation more at the grassroots level. I work on Central African Republic, for example, and the UN mission there, and the bilateral stabilization actors there are very much focused on the military response, which of course is fundamental, but that unfortunately leaves a little bit on the side many of the reconciliation initiatives that are going on at the same time at the local level, but they're not brought into the fold of the overall strategy on how to deal with the conflict, just because human limits in how much you can prioritize and put focus on. And
you bring up a good point in terms of, and it's almost 7:15, so maybe around 7:15 we'll stop and we'll open it up to the group for questions. But just on your point, in terms of the tools that we have, or we tend to use the tools that we have, which aren't necessarily the tools that we need. But when you think about a lot of the trends that you've identified, extremist groups are often agile, they're using social media, they're new technologies, they're innovative. And, our traditional ways of responding, which could be a Secretary General's statement from the UN, is that really going to reach those populations? So do you have any wisdom or any thoughts on what we could be doing better?
The UN does much more than statements
Yes.
from HQ. To be fair, because it's the UN very often operates in the situations that other bilateral actors don't want to address
Yes.
alone because they are so complicated.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a very skewed sample because it's usually the worst situations. So they're the most difficult to actually address. I think it's the long-term perspective that Virginia was talking about. It's really like being able to communicate and plan for a longer engagement that unfortunately often the Security Council mandates allow for. So peacekeepers very often are able to stabilize the situation on the ground, but then they're not able to build on that stabilization just because they are
That's not
either exactly it's either not in the mandate or the mandate ends, and so very often the UN achieves successes, but then it cannot really build on them because it doesn't have the time.
I think there's a ton more of questions that could be had, but are there questions from the audience? Yes, Dorene.
For me, I was born in the U.S., and some of the things I've learned out of a human rights background is the conflict between what's profitable, like the private, versus like human rights things. Like for instance, when the U.S. has supplied weapons to Afghanistan and directly issues like that, how do we, in your experiences, even in different conflicts, overcome those type of issues where conflict can and often is profitable for certain actors who may have more power over others, and with these conflicting interests, how can we really get anything done and really use, end violence or etc. I just want to hear some more wisdom.
I don't know how much wisdom I have on that, but
Such a challenging one.
But what I would say, which it's probably an unsatisfactory answer, but is you point very rightly in the direction of how huge the challenges are. And what we, for example, discuss in the book, so this nexus between criminal activities and armed groups and conflict, basically provide a virtually unlimited source of funding to people who are engaged in violence. And so what is actually astonishing is that we are able to try to ameliorate the situations, and sometimes we actually manage to make the situation slightly better. And that's already, I believe, a quite formidable achievement, given the vastity of the resources that many actors that are involved in the conflicts and fueling conflicts have. Just if you think about the drug trade, for example, one of the that's something that we see a lot in Latin America, but that we also see in South Asia or in Afghanistan, in Myanmar. Drug trade is a source of funding for armed groups that is practically unlimited, and so of course the rule of law and the enforcement forces are up to a humongous challenge.
Yes.
I have a question regarding, I guess, the ethnicity covariant in driving or motivating armed conflict. And my background is very regionally specific to Eastern Europe and Pacific space, so I can't really speak to the universality of this observation. But it was my understanding that incidence of ethnic heterogeneity doesn't necessarily mandate violent fracture along ethnic lines, and in fact, there are often instances of almost reverse causality where we have a leader who's politicizing a specific identity or ethnicity in order to foment some sort of violence. And I guess my question is that there have been, at least historically, other more potent grievances that are maybe more economic in nature. And sort of given that, how can you tackle kind of like the nuanced impact that ethnicity has on conflict or violence? Like what, in addition to sort of ethnicity, what other factors are examined in kind of that Y output or X input equals Y output equation, if that makes sense?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, I could not agree more. I completely agree that the causality is indeed reverse. Wars become ethnic. They do not start ethnic. So because ethnicity very often, much more often than not, becomes a way of organizing either the resistance or an armed group, or very often a way of protecting yourself. So civilians, of course, try to survive during a war, and so siding with your co-ethnics becomes a much more secure way of trying to ensure your protection than remaining neutral. So given that, I also agree with your second statement that political leaders manipulate ethnicity for their own gains. I think very often you find situations in which you need to address more underlying causes that are driving conflict, and then in a second time you need to try to de-escalate how salient ethnicity has become because of those manipulation. But yeah, no, my very simple answer would be people do not kill each other because they're different. They kill each other because they either are afraid or they need to survive. And so those are very, very very different things.
Yeah, also to add to that, it's a very much more nuanced picture. It's not just to do with ethnicity, and you can see that, for instance, in the case of northern Nigeria or northern Burkina Faso, where there are specific ethnic groups that are prevalent there, but they also happen to be, and those are areas where the conflict is more violent. But also, those are the areas that are the least developed in the country, the areas that are the most marginalized and neglected. So ethnicity is just another factor. For instance, when the central government deploys troops to that part of the country, and they tend to be oftentimes troops from a different ethnic background, they find it harder to deal with the local population given some of the differences. Sometimes also they speak different languages. So that is a compounding factor, but it's not a driving one. And even the example I was giving at the beginning with regard to Mali and the stigmatization of the Fulanis, I think even just from the point of view of us researchers, it was almost a temptation to characterize what was happening in Mali, but also we are seeing in central Nigeria and in Central African Republic elsewhere, to characterize this as a Fulani conflict. That's a mistake. We should not stigmatize the Fulanis, but there is the tendency in some literature to do that because factually, the Fulanis are they own the vast majority of cattle across Africa. So that's if you're talking about herders, they're likely to be Fulanis by default because there's so many. They're the vast majority, but this is not a Fulani conflict.
Yes.
How do you think about technology and shaping some of these trends? I mean, I was thinking when we were talking radio in Rwanda, the role of social media in the Arab Spring, and now maybe the counter-reaction, you see what's going on in China with the Uyghur population.
Yes.
And does it kind of totalize a controlling mechanism? But do you think about it as an accelerant? Is it just neutral, or are there going to be warps and waves here as you think about what we've discussed?
Yeah, I think that's a very key point, and lots of these non-state armed groups have been exploiting technology for recruitment or to coordinate attacks, and local forces are aware of this. And we're not even talking necessarily about very sophisticated technology. Sometimes it's just mobile phone technology. It's interesting, of course. You made reference to the Arab Spring and the role the social media has played in mobilizing large number of people. And I know Francesca has some interesting counterfactual to that. But I would say that something that we've been looking into in a different publication, but still IISS, is whether there is a likelihood of an African Spring to happen. It was a very interesting piece of research. The answer was not really. But the way we got to that answer was quite interesting, because we were looking at one of the key factors was the access to technology. And if you look into the more detail, if you take a closer look, you see there are very different levels of internet penetration. And even within countries, it differs quite substantially. And also, although people are very much on their phones a lot, now they're also mindful of what happened in the countries that experienced the Arab Spring. So yes, they can mobilize. We've seen more protests across sub-Saharan African countries, but people are very mindful not to repeat what happened in Libya, for instance. But technology certainly has helped people mobilize and voice their concerns and disappointments towards a number of very ineffective states. Because one of the trends that we have seen now over a long period of time is this tendency across the African continent of presidents trying to change the constitution to extend their term limits. So they want to serve forever and ever. And so people have become increasingly frustrated with that. And we've seen a number of protests, oftentimes propelled by access to technology.
Yeah, my personal view on that is that technology can propel, can determine some forms in which things are done, but it is not the cause of why. So the causes are again the ones that we have been mentioning, sort of the grievances, the marginalization, the exclusion, and then of course technology gets used in different ways, and then it creates different forms of protest or conflict. But I never think of technology as the main cause for it. The interesting counterfactual Virginia was mentioning is that when asked the question of whether technology, more specific question of whether technology facilitates mobilization, well, the answer that research on conflict has given so far is quite ambiguous. Because sometimes it does, but sometimes it doesn't. For example, in a conflict I follow, which is the conflict in Anglophone Cameroon, the armed mobilization of the separatists against the government coincided with the moment in which the government actually shut down the internet in those areas. So technology there was not a factor in facilitating mobilization. Maybe it was a factor in exacerbating the grievances, but not in making the armed resistance possible.
Yes, back here.
In terms of your research, do you have a standard methodology for just gathering your intelligence? Do you embed yourselves with local communities, just for example, the Dogon and the Fulani? Or do you have people stationed in these areas for long periods to kind of learn what's going on the local level? Are you interviewing people for brief times and getting out? Do you have like a usual practice that you apply, or just depends on the state of affairs where you are?
All of the above.
Yes. Yeah. Do you want to follow methodology?
Sure. So for the book specifically, For the book specifically, we collaborate with experts on each conflict. So these people are often based in the countries that they analyze, or they've been there for extensive periods, and so they follow the conflicts daily or at least weekly. For other pieces of research that are not necessary in this book, as you said, depends on the topic, and so we interviews. We have a database that's a companion to this book, which has started out as a more qualitative database and now is shifting to becoming a more quantitative. We do interviews, we do brief fieldwork research.
We probably have time for about 2 more questions over here. Yes.
My name is Christy, and you mentioned that the peacemakers, they usually achieve success, but they don't build, right? They can't build because sometimes the contract ends.
You were mentioning when peacekeepers come in, for example, the UN, that they often,
Yeah, so I totally agree with that because I'm from Haiti and I've seen this happening. something. They come and the situation was very hectic, and then over the years, everything became calmer, and then after that they were gone. So is there anything that, any meeting that happened that says, oh, since they've been doing a good job, let's renew the contract? So why it's always like they're just all gone, and then they don't, if they achieve success, why they don't kind of stay, and they don't make them look like they're occupying the country, but they're really seen as peacemakers? Because when I was growing up, they were there, and in my head, they were like kind of occupying the country, but now growing up, I know they were peacemakers. So, is there anything about?
I mean, unfortunately, the international architecture for peace and security is structured in a way that once the crisis, the acute crisis is over, member states lose political will and interest in situations. So it's very difficult to keep their attentions up and to convince them that, and this goes back to the point on prevention, because once, of course, a conflict is, the acute phase of a conflict is solved, that what you're entering in a phase that's more peace building, and which is also prevention for eventual relapse of violence. And so that, again, it becomes very difficult to convince member states of the importance of remaining engaged.
Because, I mean, they're putting people on the ground in another conflict area. I think that's always takes a lot of initiative and a lot of will in order to make that ultimate decision. There was somebody over, but actually you both have those. So why don't you go and then we'll end with you.
Okay. You know how you were mentioning, like, you know, the true roots of conflict are things like grievances and marginalization, kind of like forms of oppression. So, and then we also mentioned how, you know, prevention is hard to make like sexy or whatever. Like, have you guys thought about, or know folks who have thought about how to make it more of an incentive, whether that's profitable or otherwise, so it can work out well for everyone in the end?
So how to make prevention profitable?
Profitable, or somehow incentivize it so that we don't have to keep waiting for conflict to occur to fix it.
Well, I mean, the good news is that not only us thinking about it, but there is like a very big community of peacemakers thinking about that. And I mean, I've been working for the UN for the first time in 2001, and throughout the years I've seen prevention coming back onto the agenda and like being, okay, this is really something that we need to do. And so it kind of like, you know, there are the ebbs and flows, and a positive development, I think, is that under the current leadership, prevention and the Sustainable Development Goals agenda are being merged in a way in sort of in the conflict prevention and peacemaking space. And so I think that one of the part of the vision is to try to get member states who are engaged with the SDGs to think of those as a potential basis for preventing conflict. So that is it's a sort of a novel way of trying to think of the issues, because I think that the community that it's involved in peace, in conflict resolution, is constantly trying to find more incentives to try to sell prevention better.
Yeah, and in fact, one of the Sustainable Development Goals, Goal 16, is very much focused on conflict and safe society. So there is really this clear awareness that you need, you know, development and security to go hand in hand. You cannot have one without the other.
Why don't we end with your last question there?
My question is very much actually along the same vein. I think when we talk about prevention, I know when I had been studying international relations in undergrad, a lot of what we talked about was preemptive action, which was like tend to have a more negative connotation. I think you were mentioning in 2001, obviously the Iraq War, and sort of post 9/11, this preemptive action. I don't know if you could help maybe disentangle how your fields think about those, or if they don't at all, if this is just a wrong question. But we talked a lot about prevention and the positive, but I'm wondering if there's also a negative
don't try to avoid, or that can get confused with political will there?
Well, I mean, the terminology here I think is important because prevention is a very specific set of activities which are basically trying to strengthen development, strengthen the rule of law, strengthen democratic inclusion in institutions, whereas preemptive action is a specifically military action used by member states. And that is regulated by international law and basically the UN Charter, which establishes when military action is lawful or is not. So it's two very different fields of, and I think the terminology here is quite important. And of course.
If you could kind of explain, we're like 70 years on, the idea of sustainable development and security and prevention are decades old. So why is this methodology repeating itself? Is this sort of the circular nature of the politics of the UN and international communities that we're still having this discussion?
Yeah, well, it's probably because...
a little bit more why 70 years in the post-World War II era, we're still having the same methodological conversation.
Sure. I guess it goes back to the point that we pretty much know what works and what should be done. The point is like, how are we going to do it? And how are we going to convince member states that ought to be done?
On that uplifting note, thank you all for coming tonight.